Have you ever been forced to grow up before you were ready because no one else would protect the people you loved? She was 17 when the man who called himself family threw her and her three younger siblings into a snowstorm with nothing but a dented canteen and a threadbare blanket. No name, no money, no one waiting. If you had been her ankle, twisted, baby brother crying in your arms, the cold sinking into your bones, what would you have done? Would you have kept walking? Would you have stayed alive out of love or out of sheer defiance? This isn't just a story of survival. It's about a girl who refused to carry the name of a man who hurt her, and a quiet rancher who didn't ask her to earn a place, but simply gave her space to build one. What if belonging didn't come from blood, but from someone who stayed when others walked away? If that question stays with you, then maybe this story was meant for you. Stay with us. The wind came down from the bitter rock ridge like it had teeth, gnawing at the timber bones of every house in the valley. Snow had begun to fall hard by dusk, piling in thick drifts along fence lines, making the world outside Mira Dade's window blur and vanish. But the cold inside the Rudd homestead bit deeper than the weather ever could. The fire had died low hours ago. No one had bothered to feed it. Mira, 17 but older in ways she couldn't name, sat on the floor with her back against the wall, arms wrapped around her youngest brother, Jonas. He was 5, feverish and shivering. The twins, Eli and Ruth, 9 curled beside them like puppies left out too long. They said nothing, only blinked slowly in the dim light of a single lantern, waiting for what would come next. It came in the form of a slammed door and the thick, whiskey-laced voice of their uncle, Harlan Rudd. "You think you can just lie around while I starve in my own damn house?" he growled, staggering into the room. His boots tracked snow and mud onto the warped floorboards. He kicked over a stool, pointing a shaking finger. "You spilled the soup. Mira, that was the last damn bit. Do you know what meat costs these days?" Mira didn't flinch. She had learned years ago that reacting only gave him more fuel. She tightened her grip on Jonas, her jaw locked. "It was an accident," she said softly. "No such thing as accident when mouths don't work and hands are lazy." Harlan barked, "Your mama's dead, your daddy vanished, and I'm the only thing between you and the wolves. You ungrateful rats think you're owed something." He moved toward them, his shadow long and trembling on the walls. The lantern flickered as if it, too, feared what was to come. Mira stood slowly, placing Jonas behind her. She didn't speak this time. Her silence was more defiant than any shout. Harlan stared at her, his eyes bloodshot and furious. Then he did something she didn't expect. He laughed. A dry, bitter sound. "Fine," he said. "You want to be grown, then go be grown." He turned and stomped toward the back room. Mira heard drawers slam, boots thump. When he returned, he was holding a threadbare blanket and a dented canteen. He threw them at her feet. "Out," he said simply. "Take your precious siblings and get. Ain't nothing here for you but my pity." And that's worn thin. Mira didn't beg. She didn't cry. She crouched down, bundled Jonas tighter in her shawl, whispered to Eli and Ruth to gather what little they had: an old scarf, a crust of bread, a worn book of prayers, and together they walked out into the storm. The door closed behind them like a period at the end of a sentence. Final, cold, done. Outside, the world was a blur of white and wind. The snow came at them sideways, pushed by gusts that made Mira's shawl flap like a torn sail. Her boots were too thin, her hands already going numb, but she didn't stop. She kept walking, following the faint outline of the trail that led down from Rudd's house and toward what she didn't know. There was no plan, only the instinct to move, to put distance between her and the voice that had shouted them into the dark. The children followed without question. Their trust in Mira was the only thing they had left. Step by step, they pressed on, Mira leaning into the wind, like a tree trying not to fall. Each breath hurt, each footstep was a prayer. By the time they reached the edge of the lowland plain near Bitter Rock Creek, the snow had coated their hair, their shoulders, their eyelashes. Jonas whimpered, and Mira lifted him into her arms. Her legs trembled, but she didn't stop. Then her foot slipped. She landed hard on her knees. The world spinning, Jonas cried out softly. Mira gasped, felt a searing pain in her ankle, and knew she couldn't go much farther. The trail had vanished beneath the storm. Trees stood like silent judges in the white haze, unmoving and indifferent. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The children huddled around her as she sat in the snow, heart pounding, breath short. She looked up into the blinding sky and whispered, not to the heavens, but to whatever might be listening. If there's anyone out there, anyone who sees us, please. No one answered, but a mile away, on a ridge above a cattle fence buried in snow, a man on horseback paused. His name was Silas Beckett. He saw tracks 4 sets. One staggered, not animal, human, too small for grown men. His horse shifted, snorted. Silas narrowed his eyes against the wind. He dismounted. The snow softened the world into a hush so complete, it seemed time itself had paused to listen. Mira Dade didn't know how long they'd sat there, her body frozen in place, cradling Jonas, while Eli and Ruth pressed their small bodies close against her sides, trying to share what little warmth remained. The wind had calmed, but the stillness that followed wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that felt thick with waiting, like the earth was holding its breath, unsure what came next. Her breath came in shallow bursts, each one leaving a ghostly puff in the air. Her fingers no longer ached. That scared her more than the cold. It meant they were past feeling, edging toward something more dangerous. She blinked slowly, forced herself to stay upright. For the children. For Jonas, who had stopped crying and simply stared now with wide, vacant eyes. Then hoofbeats, faint at first, then clearer. Mira raised her head, heart thudding in her chest. A dark shape moved through the white. A horse, then the outline of a man atop it. Her mind reeled. She had imagined help before, had seen rescuers in the snow, only to realize it was just shadow and wind. But this time, the figure came closer, real, steady. The man dismounted before he even reached them, moving with purpose. He didn't call out or ask questions. He simply approached, slow and careful, his boots crunching through the snow. When he saw Mira's face, pale, lips blue, eyes too alert for someone so near, collapse, he nodded once, then bent and lifted Jonas from her arms. Mira tried to rise, but her body betrayed her. Her ankle throbbed from the fall, and her legs buckled beneath her. She gasped, more from frustration than pain. "You'll ride," the man said. His voice was low, calm, not urgent, but firm. He placed Jonas in the saddle first, then helped Ruth and Eli climb up behind. The horse shifted, sensing the extra weight, but stilled at a touch from its master. When the man turned to her, Mira hesitated. She hated being lifted, hated the feeling of being helpless. But her body had given up the argument. She let him take her arm. He said nothing when she winced, just wrapped one arm under her knees and the other around her back, lifted her like she weighed nothing, and set her behind the children. Then, without a word, he took the reins and led them away from the place where hope had nearly ended. The ride back was quiet. The snow fell in slow spirals now, no longer angry, but heavy. Mira leaned into Eli's back, her eyes fluttering closed. She didn't sleep, not quite, but let the sway of the horse and the warmth of her siblings' bodies keep her tethered to the present. The man led them for what felt like hours, through trees and over small rises, until at last the outline of a house came into view, timber-framed, wide-roofed, low to the ground, like it knew how to survive winters. A lantern flickered in one window. A smoke trail wound from the chimney, thin and gray against the white sky. He helped them down, one by one. When Mira's feet touched the ground, pain shot up her leg, and she nearly cried out. She bit her tongue. He noticed, but didn't speak, just took her arm again and guided her inside. The warmth of the cabin hit her like a wave. It smelled of cedar, ash, and something faintly sweet, perhaps coffee or bread, long since gone stale. The hearth blazed at the far end, orange and steady. A rug, worn but thick, stretched across the wooden floor. A rocking chair sat in the corner, its seat dented from years of use. He ushered them in, wordlessly, laid Jonas on the rug near the fire, told Ruth and Eli to sit. Then he turned back to Mira. "Sit," he said, nodding to the wooden bench near the table. "I can help," she said, her voice cracked from cold and disuse. He looked at her a moment later. She sat. He moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, lighting another lamp, stoking the fire, pulling blankets from a trunk. He handed one to each child, then brought her a mug of something warm. She held it between her palms like it was gold. When they were all wrapped and fed, he spoke again. "My name's Silas Beckett. This is my land, my house. You can stay till you're warm and able." Mira met his eyes. They were pale, gray-blue, steady as still water. She nodded. "I'm Mira. These are Eli, Ruth, and Jonas." He nodded once more, then moved to stoke the fire again. No questions, no judgment. That night, Mira lay on the rug beside her siblings, the fire casting soft shadows on the walls. Silas sat in the chair, his boots off, a book open in his lap, though he didn't seem to be reading. Mira didn't sleep easily. The warmth was almost too much, her body confused by comfort. Her mind ran with questions. Who was this man? Why did he help them? What did he expect? But as the flames danced, and Jonas breathed softly against her side, a thought came to her, unbidden. Maybe not everyone left. Morning came slow and pale, filtered through a sky thick with lingering snow clouds. The fire had burned low, casting only faint warmth, but it was enough to keep the frost from biting at their noses. Mira Dade opened her eyes to the creak of floorboards and the smell of coffee, not the sweet, rich kind from town, but something strong and bitter that filled the lungs like wood smoke. For a moment, she didn't move. It took her a beat to remember where she was. She turned her head gently. Ruth and Eli still slept close, their breathing steady. Jonas stirred, a soft moan escaping his chapped lips. But he didn't wake. Mira carefully pushed herself up, ignoring the pull in her ankle, and sat against the wall. Her fingers found her braid, still stiff with melted snow. She unwound it slowly, methodically, not because it mattered, but because routine was something she could still control. Across the room, Silas Beckett sat at the table, back straight, a half-eaten biscuit in one hand and a small pocket journal open beside his mug. He glanced up when she moved, nodded once, and then returned to his quiet breakfast. He didn't ask how she was, didn't offer comfort or small talk, but he placed another biscuit on a tin plate and slid it toward the edge of the table closer to her. Mira hesitated. She hated the feeling of taking without giving, even when she had nothing else to offer. Still, she stood slowly, limped toward the table, and sat on the bench. The warmth of the biscuit surprised her. He must have made it fresh that morning. She ate in silence, careful not to wake the others. After a while, Silas spoke not directly to her, but not entirely to himself either. Snow won't ease for another day, maybe two. You're welcome to stay that long. Mira swallowed the last of the biscuit, her voice hoarse. We'll find a way out after. I won't be a burden. He didn't look up, didn't say you were. That was the end of it. By midday, Mira had managed to wrap her ankle with a strip of cloth torn from one of Silas's old shirts, which he left out without comment. She moved about slowly, helping Ruth gather kindling from the lean-to outside, while Eli brushed snow from the porch rail. Jonas stayed in the cabin, too tired to move, but more alert than the day before. It wasn't a home, not yet, but it wasn't the Rudd house either. There were no threats in the shadows, no slamming doors or drunken curses. There was only the sound of boots on old wood, the clink of metal pans, and the wind humming against the shutters. That night, Mira offered to make supper. Silas raised an eyebrow, but stepped aside. She found onions hanging from a hook in the pantry, dried beans in a sack by the hearth, and broth bones simmering from earlier that day. She moved quietly, but confidently stirring, seasoning, tasting. When she ladled stew into wooden bowls, Silas didn't speak, just ate, nodded once, and filled his own cup with water from the kettle. Later, as the children drifted to sleep again, Mira sat near the fire, her hands wrapped around a tin cup. Silas sat across from her in the rocker, sharpening a knife with slow, even strokes. You live out here alone, she asked, not looking up. He paused only briefly. Since the 72. That long, he nodded. Wasn't the plan. Life shifts. Mira stared into the flames. Ours shifted last night. She didn't elaborate, didn't need to. There was a long pause before Silas said, You got people to go back to? No, Mira said simply. He looked at her then, eyes searching, not intruding. You ran, I was thrown, she said. Out into the snow like bad meat. Silas didn't respond with pity or surprise. He simply nodded again and returned to his sharpening. Mira's shoulders relaxed for the first time in what felt like years. In the days that followed, the snow stayed, but the silence softened. Mira began rising before dawn, checking the kettle, folding blankets, feeding the chickens behind the barn. Silas watched, but said little. The children began to smile again. Ruth helped gather eggs. Eli learned to sweep the porch with proud concentration, and Jonas followed Mira like her own shadow, clinging to her skirt hem with sticky fingers and sleepy eyes. It was Ruth who asked first, Mira, is this our new home? Mira hesitated. The word home sat heavy in her chest. She glanced out the window toward Silas, who was chopping wood in the yard, snow crusted on his shoulders. He didn't look up, didn't need to. I don't know yet, she whispered. But we're not freezing, and no one's yelling. Ruth nodded, as if that were enough. That night, Mira found a second quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bedrolls. It hadn't been there before. No one said who placed it. She didn't ask. Snow still lined the edges of the porch, 3 days after Mira Dade and her siblings arrived at Silas Beckett's ranch. But inside the cabin, the chill had begun to lift, not just from the hearth, but from something deeper. There was a new kind of warmth now, one Mira couldn't quite name. It came not from words, but from rhythm, quiet, deliberate, dependable. Each morning began the same. Mira stirred before dawn, padding softly across creaking floorboards, careful not to wake the children. The first thing she did, always, was check the fire. If it was low, she added kindling. If it had gone out, she relit it with practiced patience. She had learned, long ago, that warmth was never a guarantee. You had to choose it, fight for it, feed it. Silas never said anything when he rose to find the fire already lit, a pot of water steaming gently on the iron hook. He would simply nod, pour a mug of the bitter coffee he favored, and hand her one without asking. Then he'd pull on his coat and head out to check the animals, his boots crunching softly over snow. One morning, Mira followed. She didn't say she would. She just wrapped herself in her shawl and stepped into her old boots, still stiff from the freeze. Her ankle ached, but she ignored it. Outside, the world glittered, snow packed in low banks around the corral, icicles hanging like glass teeth from the eaves. Silas glanced over his shoulder, saw her approach, and didn't tell her to stop. He led her to the barn, inside. It was dim and smelled of hay, manure, and the faint, musky warmth of animals. A brown mare nickered softly as they entered. Silas rubbed her neck, then tossed a flake of hay into her stall. Mira watched, then reached for a fork and mimicked his motion for the next. They didn't speak. When she moved too quickly and knocked a bucket over, he didn't scold her, just righted it and handed her a new one. When her hands fumbled the latch on the stall, he showed her once, slowly, then stepped back and let her try again. That was the way of things. She made mistakes. He let her. She learned later, when the children helped sweep the barn aisle. Mira sat for a moment on an overturned crate, wiping sweat from her brow. Silas crouched nearby, hammering a loose board into place. "Your ankle's better," he said without looking up. Mira nodded, still sore. He handed her a canteen. "You're pushing it." "I have to," she said. "If I stop moving, I think too much." He met her eyes then, just for a second. Something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, not understanding, but something close. That evening, as the wind picked up again and snow whispered against the shutters, Mira set a pot of stew to simmer. The cabin smelled of thyme, onion, and something else. Something like memory. Ruth braided Mira's hair beside the fire. Eli read aloud from an old book Silas had left on the shelf. Jonas napped with one arm curled around a faded rag doll someone had left behind long ago. Silas sat in his usual spot by the rocker, whittling a piece of soft wood into something unspoken. Mira watched him from the corner of her eye. He never asked about their past, never once pressed for details. She had come to expect questions. "Where's your family? Why were you out in the snow, but they never came?" And that, more than anything, made her want to answer. She waited until the children were asleep. "I was 13 when Mama died," she said, staring at the fire. Silas didn't react, but she knew he was listening. She had a cough that wouldn't quit. Cold winters, no doctor. We couldn't afford it anyway. She passed on a Tuesday. Daddy left the next spring. Said he was going to Butte to find work in the mines. Never sent a letter, never came back. She folded her hands in her lap. Harlan was Mama's brother. Took us in, but only so he could claim the land. He drank. Said we owed him for every mouthful we ate. I stayed quiet. Did what I could, but that night I spilled soup, That's all it took. Silas's hands slowed on the whittling, then stilled. "You didn't deserve that," he said. Mira's throat tightened. "I don't know what I deserve, but I know what I won't accept anymore." He nodded, then tossed a curl of shaved wood into the fire. "I built this place after my wife and boy died," he said, voice quiet. "Had nothing left but a couple head of cattle and a ridge too rocky for planting. So I worked, didn't talk much, didn't ask for anything." Mira looked at him, and now he shrugged. "Still don't talk much." A pause. "But sometimes you keep the fire going for more than just yourself." The words settled between them, gentle as falling snow. Mira didn't reply. She didn't need to. She understood. That night, before crawling under the blanket beside her siblings, she added 2 extra logs to the fire, just to be sure it would last till morning. The snow began to melt the same way pain dulls gradually, without fanfare, but unmistakably. By early March, patches of brown earth peeked through the white, and the path from the barn to the creek became slush instead of silence. Chickens clucked louder in the mornings. The cows grew restless in their pens. The world was waking up, and Mira Dade could feel it in her bones. The children had started laughing again. They raced around the front yard in boots 2 sizes too big, built crooked snowmen, and took turns pushing Jonas on an old feed cart. Mira watched from the porch, her shawl pulled close, her heart full of something almost unfamiliar peace. Inside, she had begun keeping the cabin tidy, the way her mother once did, sweeping the corners, organizing the shelf of Silas's books, hanging dried herbs in the window. She wasn't trying to replace anything, just to keep things from falling apart. Silas, for his part, had grown used to the clatter of little feet and the hum of soft voices in a house that had known too much quiet. He didn't ask questions, still moved with the calm deliberation of a man used to solitude, but there was a new softness in the way he left an extra biscuit on the counter, or carved a small wooden fox and left it on Jonas's bedroll. The night before it happened, Mira had sat at the table, sewing a patch onto Ruth's coat, while Silas oiled his saddle. They didn't speak much, but it was the kind of silence that carried weight, not distance. A silence full of things understood without needing to be said. It was a Thursday when the wagon came. Mira heard it first, a distant creak, unnatural in the hush of the early afternoon. She straightened from where she'd been pulling weeds from the garden bed. The children were playing by the fence. Silas was splitting logs out back. The wagon rolled up the ridge road slowly, its wheels thick with mud, drawn by a tired gray mule. 2 figures sat atop the seat, one broad-shouldered and slumped, the other lean, young, eyes sharp, even from a distance. Mira's blood ran cold. She knew that gait, that hunched figure, the tilt of the hat pulled low over mean eyes. Harlan Rudd. She froze. Eli was the first to notice her change in posture. "Mira," he asked. Quiet. She didn't answer. Her hands had clenched into fists, buried in her apron. She watched the wagon roll to a stop a few feet from the porch. The mule snorted, tail flicking. Harlan climbed down slow, brushing dirt from his coat like he owned the land beneath him. "Well, look at this," he said, voice like a snake coiled in the sun. "Didn't think you'd crawl this far." Mira didn't move. The boy with him, no more than 15, looked around the ranch yard like he was sizing it up. He wore a smirk, one that made Mira's stomach turn. She didn't recognize him, but it didn't matter. Harlan stepped closer. I heard there were some orphans holed up out here. Figured I ought to do the right thing. Come collect family." She found her voice, low and steady. "You left us in the snow, Harlan." He shrugged. "You left me no choice. You stole from me, took food, my mule, my peace." Silas stepped out from behind the barn before she could speak again. His coat was still dusted with sawdust, his gloves in one hand. He moved, slow, unhurried, but there was a steel in his gaze. "You'll need to leave," he said. Harlan turned. "You the one playing house out here with my niece and her little whelps?" Silas didn't answer. He didn't need to. Harlan laughed, bitter and hard. "They got my blood, my sister's kids. I got rights. You gave up your rights the day you pushed them into a blizzard." Silas said. "You got no claim." Harlan snapped. "No papers, no marriage, no kin. You just a name on a mailbox." Silas took a step forward. His voice dropped to something cold. "I'm the one who stayed." For a moment. The only sound was the wind. Then Harlan spat at the dirt and turned back to Mira. "You think you'll be safe here? With some rancher playing hero. I got a lawyer in town says I can take 'em all if I want." Ruth had stepped out of the cabin by now, clutching Jonas's hand. Mira stepped between them, eyes hard. "You want to take them? Over my dead body." "That can be arranged," Harlan growled. Silas didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon. Just stood beside Mira, solid as the earth. Then, one by one, neighbors appeared. From the south path came Mrs. Holloway from the bakery, arms crossed, eyes fierce. From the north, Mr. Adler, the blacksmith, leaned against his cane. A ranch hand from across the creek stepped into view. They had come, not by invitation, but by instinct. "I saw this girl carry 3 kids through a flood." Mrs. Holloway said loud enough for all to hear. "I seen this man bring food when no one else did," said Mr. Adler. "You don't need blood to build a family," someone muttered. Harlan looked around, eyes narrowing. The boy beside him shifted, uncertain now. "You all siding with strangers over kin." Harlan spat. Mira raised her voice, steady and sure. "I was a child when you beat the name out of my mouth. I was a child when you left me bleeding on the floor. I'm not a child now." She turned to the crowd. "My name is Mira Dade, but I don't belong to that blood. I belong to the people who stayed when it snowed, who brought firewood and stew and didn't ask me to earn it." She looked back at Harlan. "You want to take something? You're already empty-handed." He stared a second longer. Then, with a grunt, he turned, climbed back onto the wagon, and yanked the reins. The mule groaned. They left the way they came into the gray distance. The children didn't cheer. Mira didn't cry. Silas didn't speak. But as the wagon vanished over the ridge, something broke and something healed, all at once. The wagon was long gone, its tracks fading beneath the slush that pooled in the dirt road. Still, Mira Dade stood frozen at the edge of the yard, her arms hanging stiff at her sides, heart pounding like a drum she couldn't silence. The voices of the neighbors had fallen away. The world had quieted again, too quickly. And in that hush, her mind began to echo with things unspoken. She had stood her ground. She had faced the man who had made her childhood a cage and said no. The fire in her words had drawn a line in the dirt and dared Harlan Rudd to cross it. He hadn't. He had backed away. And yet, she didn't feel triumphant. There was no rush of pride, no relief, only a strange, aching emptiness, as though part of her had expected to be dragged away, to be told once more that she had no right to choose who she was. Instead, she was left standing in the stillness, surrounded by people who had defended her. And yet, she felt more alone than she had in days. Behind her, Silas Beckett stood watchful, hands in his coat pockets, gaze unreadable. He didn't move toward her, he didn't speak, but his presence was like a hand on her shoulder, steady, silent, unyielding. Ruth tugged gently on Mira's skirt. "Can we go inside?" Mira nodded. Her voice caught somewhere in her throat. That night, the cabin was warmer than usual, not because the fire burned hotter, but because the children clung to her like they had the first night, grateful, frightened, and needing her to be the wall between them and the world. She laid beside them, awake long after their breathing had softened into sleep. Shadows flickered on the beams above as the fire cracked gently in the hearth, and she thought not about Harlan's threats, not about lawyers or claims or the townsfolk who had spoken up, but about the question that had lingered in her chest for years. What does blood really owe you? She had believed once that family was a tether, something fixed, inescapable. It was pain, yes, but also identity. A name was a binding. Even when it hurt, it held you in place. But now, that tether had frayed, or maybe she had cut it. She wasn't sure which scared her more. The next morning, she rose early and stepped outside before the others woke. The air was sharp, tinged with spring but still cold enough to sting her nose. She walked the perimeter of the yard, past the barn, down toward the creek where the ice had begun to crack into shards of glass. She stood there, watching water run beneath the surface. Silas approached without warning, silent as ever. He didn't ask if she was okay. He never did. Instead, he said, "You meant what you said yesterday." She didn't look at him. Every word. He nodded, slow. "Doesn't mean it's over." "I know. Law's tricky. Words twist. Men lie." "I know," she said again, sharper this time. He studied her face. "You scared?" She turned to him finally, her eyes tired, but steady, terrified. "Good," he said. That startled her. She blinked. "Good." He shrugged. "Fear means you care what happens. It means you're still in it." Mira scoffed, but softly. "I'm tired of being in it." Silas stepped closer, not invading, just near enough to lower his voice. "You fought yesterday. Not just for them, for you." "I don't know what I'm fighting for," she said, almost a whisper. "I don't have a claim, no deed, no name worth anything. I just have breath." Silas nodded. "Sometimes breath's all a fire needs." She didn't answer, just stood there, staring at the thawing creek. That afternoon, Mira found herself scrubbing the wooden floor of the cabin, not out of necessity, but because her body needed something to do. The children were outside playing in the first real sunlight of the season. Silas was mending the corral fence. She paused, resting on her knees, hands red from the bucket water. Then she went to the corner, where Silas kept a small crate of tools and papers. She rummaged carefully, respectfully, at the bottom, beneath some old fencing blueprints and ledgers. She found what she didn't know she was looking for: a leather-bound Bible, the pages worn thin in some places, tucked between Psalm and Proverbs. A folded slip of paper. She opened it. It was a birth record. Silas's son, Nathaniel Beckett, born 1871, died 1874. Mira sat on the floor, paper in hand, throat tight. That night, after dinner, after the children had gone to bed, she handed the paper to Silas without a word. He took it, glanced at it, then folded it again and slipped it back where it belonged. She was sick, he said, staring into the fire. "My wife." Flu came through fast, Boycotted a week later. I buried them on the hill behind the ridge. I'm sorry, Mira said. Silas nodded. Me too. A long silence. Then he said, You're allowed to feel the weight. Mira, you don't have to carry it quiet. She looked at him, eyes brimming. I don't know who I am without the pain. Then maybe it's time to find out. That night, when she lay down beside her siblings, she whispered her own name, Mira, and then, like testing a sound she wasn't sure fit just Mira, for now. The wind was quieter now, more like breath than warning. The trees no longer groaned beneath the weight of winter, and the sun lingered longer each day, stretching soft gold across the porch railings and warming the earth just enough to scent the air with damp bark and thawed soil. But inside Mira Dade, there was a different kind of thaw happening, one that came slower, deeper, more dangerous in its quiet promise. It had been a week since Harlan Rudd's wagon disappeared over the ridge, and while no letter from a lawyer had arrived, Mira lived each day with her guard up. She watched the trail from the porch, eyes scanning for the cloud of dust, the flick of reins, the familiar figure who had spent her childhood reminding her she owed him everything. But what haunted her more than Harlan's shadow was the question Silas Beckett had left her with that morning by the creek. What if you're more than what they made you carry? That question had burrowed deep, digging through years of fear disguised as loyalty, silence worn as survival, and duty mistaken for identity. She had always stayed for her siblings Jonas, still too small to understand the cost of safety. Ruth, tender-hearted but fierce. Eli, so desperate to prove he was strong. They were her reason, her tether. But for the first time, Mira wondered what it would mean to stay for herself. It was that wondering that led her, one afternoon, to the barn. Silas was inside, brushing down the mare, his movements steady, almost meditative. He looked up when she entered, but said nothing. She walked to the workbench, picked up a small carving knife and a scrap of pine wood, and sat on the overturned feed crate near the open window. They worked in silence for a while, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Outside, the children's laughter drifted on the breeze, bright and sharp like bells. After a time, Mira set down the knife and turned to him. I want to make something that stays, she said. Silas glanced over. Then you will? I mean something real, she continued, fingers tightening around the block of wood. Something that says, I was here, that I chose this. He nodded slowly. What did you have in mind? A sign, she said, for the front gate. He tilted his head. What should it say? She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, not yet sure, that night, after dinner, Mira sat on the porch steps while the children played in the dying light. Silas stood nearby, leaning against the post, arms crossed. You ever think about changing your name? He asked. Mira blinked, startled. He didn't look at her, just said, You don't have to keep carrying something that never carried you. I wouldn't know what to change it to, she said, her voice barely a breath. He turned to face her then, really looked. Then maybe don't pick one that comes from pain. Pick one that comes from place, from choice, from what you've built. Mira looked out over the ranch yard, the chicken coop she had helped repair, the path she'd shoveled clear a dozen times, the crooked fence line where Eli had driven his first nail. What if I'm afraid? She whispered. Silas didn't hesitate. Then you're exactly where you should be. Are you? The following morning, Mira rose before dawn. The sky was still navy, stars blinking their last before the sun. She crept into the barn, took the same pine board she'd been carving, and laid it flat across the bench. She took her time with the letters, each stroke slow and deliberate. Not for anyone else, just for her. When she finished, she didn't cry, but something inside her exhaled for the first time in years. Later that afternoon, she walked to the gatepost and nailed the sign into place. It read, Beckett Ranch. No blood, all heart. She stepped back, looked at the letters glowing gold in the sun, and felt it settle inside her like a final stone placed in a foundation. That evening, Silas found her standing at the sink, washing the last of the supper plates. I saw the sign, he said. She dried her hands, turned to him. I don't know if it's official, she said with a half smile. He stepped closer. I think it is if you say it is. Mira nodded, slow. Silas reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded slip of paper, laid it gently on the table between them. A marriage application. She stared at it, unmoving. I'm not asking, he said, his voice gruff as ever. Just offering. Her throat tightened. He tapped the paper once. Name lines blank. You can fill it in if you want, or not. This place, it's yours, either way. Mira sat down, picked up the pencil. She wrote, Mira Beckett. And beneath it, in smaller print by heart, not by blood, Silas said nothing, just smiled barely. But enough. That night, they stood at the porch rail while the sky turned violet and the stars returned. She didn't need a ceremony, a ring, or a preacher. She didn't even need the paper. All she needed was this place, this fire, these hands that stayed, and that, she realized, was how you knew something was yours. Because you chose it. In the weeks that followed, the earth softened beneath Mira Beckett's boots. Yes, she still thought of herself as Dade. Sometimes old habits took time, but more and more. She found that when she answered to Beckett, something inside her didn't flinch. It didn't shrink. It settled. The thaw had come in more than weather. Morning chores became rhythm. Ruth now knew when to stir the ashes and when to add wood. Eli could harness the mule without being told. Jonas had stopped waking Mira in the night, and instead began humming to himself as he stacked pebbles in the yard. Content and full of small purpose, Mira spent her days doing what her hands remembered and then what they wanted to learn. She fixed the door on the chicken coop that had hung crooked all winter. She lined the pantry shelves with cloth, cut from her mother's old dress, long since worn through at the seams. She stitched new straps for the feed sacks. Each task was quiet, deliberate, an act of rebuilding not just of place, but of self. Silas noticed. He always did. He never said, "Good job." He never praised aloud, but she would find tools cleaned and laid out where she'd need them next. Nails refilled. A mug of warm milk left near her sewing basket. A carved wooden ladle on the kitchen shelf, smooth and newly shaped. One morning, Mira found a worn but sturdy saddle blanket draped over the porch rail. No note. Just there, waiting. She smiled and folded it over her arm like a promise unspoken. In the late afternoons, Mira taught the children under the open eaves of the barn, not just her own siblings, but others too, kids from homesteads nearby, many of whom had never held a slate or heard their names called with kindness. Silas helped her rig a long table from an old workbench. The barn smelled of hay and dust, and light filtered in through knotholes and broken planks. But none of that mattered. What mattered was how the children sat straighter when Mira said, "You matter." How they whispered letters into the air like prayers. How they learned to spell their names like declarations. It was Ruth who asked one afternoon, while balancing on a milking stool during reading practice. Mira. What does Beckett mean? Mira looked up from the primer. Why? Because that's our name now. Right? I just want to know where it came from. Mira hesitated. Then she said, "It came from a man who didn't ask me to be someone else. He just made room for who I already was." The children didn't question that. Later that night, Mira found Silas repairing the barn door latch. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You know they're calling themselves Beckett." Now she asked. He paused, looked at her, brow lifted. They started it. I didn't correct them." Silas smiled faintly. "Didn't think you would?" She stepped closer. "Does that bother you?" "No," he said simply. "It honors me." Then he added, "Truth is, I think they're the ones who gave the name meaning again." She nodded, and together they finished mending the latch as the sun dipped low, casting the barn an amber light. The days rolled on, and so did the work. Spring brought wild lilac near the creek and a burst of color across the hills. Mira began planting herbs, simple ones, first mint, rosemary, sage. She didn't know if the soil would hold them, but she tried anyway. That was the kind of faith she'd learned here. Faith in hands, not promises. And some evenings, when she sat beside Silas at the porch rail, both of them tired in that good, bone-deep way, she would glance down at her calloused palms and think not of what they had endured, but what they had built. It was not a grand life, but it was honest, and hers. It was near dusk when Mira Beckett stepped inside the barn alone, the scent of cedar and old hay lingering in the air, warm from the sunlight that had soaked the wood all afternoon. The last of the children's voices had faded with the setting sun, and Silas had stayed behind, saying he'd fix the broken bench leg before supper. But when Mira opened the door, she saw he wasn't mending anything. He sat at the table that doubled as the classroom desk, elbows resting on its rough surface, staring down at something folded and plain, a piece of paper, creased once, through the middle, no markings on the outside. He didn't look up when she entered, but he didn't need to. His stillness was invitation enough. She walked slowly, brushing dust from the back of her skirt, and came to stand beside him. He pushed the paper toward her without a word. She unfolded it carefully. It was clean, precise, and official, a marriage application. Simple and unadorned, the kind the county clerk kept in a drawer near the stamps and deed records. The line for bride's name was blank, but across the bottom, in Silas's sharp, deliberate hand, there was one sentence: "She can choose to carry my name." But I've carried her for a long time already. Mira stared at the words, her eyes tracing every letter as though they might shift under her breath. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply looked at Silas, who now lifted his gaze to meet hers. "I'm not asking you," he said, voice low, steady. "This isn't something I need. The ranch is still yours either way. The children still belong. I just thought maybe you might want it." Mira folded the paper again, careful, reverent almost. "I never thought I'd be asked," she said quietly. Silas gave a slight shrug. "Then I'm sorry it took so long." She set the paper down on the desk and reached for the pencil that lay beside it. Her fingers hovered above the blank line for a long moment. And then, with the same calm with which she once faced the man who tried to take everything from her, she wrote Mira Beckett. She paused, then added, "By choice, not by need." When she turned back to Silas, he hadn't moved. She said, "I don't carry shame anymore, just the name I chose, and the one you gave room for." He rose then, slowly, and stepped beside her. Without a word, he took the pencil from her hand, and beneath her name, he drew a line, no flourish, no loop, just one steady mark across the wood-grain surface. A line for the rest of our story, he murmured. And in the hush that followed, they stood side by side, not facing a preacher, not under an arch of flowers, not dressed for ceremony, but joined by something older than vows, respect, patience, and the willingness to stay through every storm. The spring morning arrived with a scent too gentle to name part wild lilac, part worn leather, part smoke from a fire that had burned all night, not because it needed to, but because someone had chosen to keep it going. At Beckett Ranch, the day didn't begin with trumpets or bells. It began with dough on the children's fingers, flour smudged across cheeks, a kettle whistling softly, and the front door left open to let in the light. Neighbors came slowly at first, then more certain with each step. They wore Sunday shirts, but boots caked with trail dust. Some rode in on mules or mares, others walked with arms linked or baskets in hand. They didn't come for spectacle. They came because when something honest grows from ruins, you show up, you bear witness. There was no preacher in a grand chapel, no music, no aisle, just a pine arch Silas had built with Ruth's help, its beams tied with bundles of wildflowers and sage. The arch stood in the field where cattle once grazed, now lined with borrowed chairs, wooden benches, and the hushed breath of those who had seen the worst and stayed to watch what came next. Silas Beckett waited beneath it, his best shirt pressed flat, sleeves rolled once at the cuffs, hair combed and clean-shaven for the first time in months, not to impress, but to show he could be trusted with a life beside his. Mira Beckett came walking slow, her pace sure, a braid down her back, tied with her mother's old ribbon. She wore no veil. Her dress was hand-sewn by 3 neighbor women who stitched strength into every seam. In her arms, Jonas, still too young to understand vows, but old enough to know this was something worth remembering. When she reached Silas, there was no pause, no need for instructions. She simply stood beside him. And the preacher, an old man with a voice like soft gravel, asked the usual words, but neither Mira nor Silas let him finish. "I don't need someone who shares my blood," Silas said, his voice clear and steady. "Just someone who brings fire home and keeps it burning." A hush rippled, but no one laughed. Because here, in Bitter Rock, everyone knew what it meant to keep a fire alive through winter. Then Mira, still holding her brother, turned to the crowd, her voice steady as mountain air. "A name is something you're born with, but it can be stripped, poisoned, forgotten. A place in this world that's something you earn." She looked at Silas. "Today, I choose mine. I carry the name Beckett, not because I was born into it, but because someone made space for me in it." The preacher stepped back, hands folded. There were no rings exchanged, no kiss for show, just the quiet joining of 2 hands that had known work, loss, and rebuilding. Later, after the dust had settled and the guests had gone, Mira stood before the cabin, now etched with a new sign above the door, Beckett Ranch, family. No blood, all heart. Below the letters, a row of muddy handprints ran across the wood. Jonas's small and curved, Ruth's firm. Eli's pressed with too much force, like he wanted to be sure it stayed. Inside, the fire crackled low. Silas knelt beside it, feeding it slowly with cedar and pine. Behind him, laughter spilled from the kitchen where Mira and the children shaped biscuits, flour flying like ash in the light. Silas didn't turn, didn't say a word. He simply smiled and leaned the poker back against the hearth, knowing now he wasn't the only one tending the flame. And outside, the wind danced past Bitter Rock, light and free, carrying not sorrow or silence this time, but something softer, something that stayed. Sometimes, the people who share your blood can be the ones who hurt you the most, and sometimes, the ones who save you, come without titles, without obligation, but with quiet hands that stay when things fall apart. This story reminds us that family isn't always where we're born. It's what we choose to build, day by day, with patience and care. It's found in the ones who chop firewood without asking, who sit in silence beside you, who see your pain but never ask you to explain it. For those of us who have lost, been left behind, or had to start again with nothing but our name or no name at all, there's comfort in knowing that belonging is not something others give you. It's something you decide to claim. And maybe that's the truest kind of family, not made by blood, but by staying. If you've ever had to carry more than your share, or learn to live with what you were never given, this story is a quiet reminder. You're not alone, and it's never too late to choose where you belong. Thank you for spending your time with us today. If this story touched something in your heart, if it reminded you that love can be chosen and family can be built, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Here at Wild West Echoes, we tell stories where quiet strength speaks louder than words, and hope always finds its way home. We'd be honored to have you ride with us a little longer.